The Venezuela story is picking up. The US is raising the stakes. It is intensifying its blockade and targeting Venezuelan oil tankers. In the last few days, US forces have boarded 2 vessels, and now they're pursuing a third one. They've also struck 28 boats in the region and killed more than 100 people. Trump started off by calling it an operation against Venezuelan drug cartels. But it's increasingly clear that this is about oil and regime change. Washington is trying to choke Venezuela's oil revenues and destabilize the regime of Nicolas Maduro. So will America start a war in Venezuela? The US president, in his own words, does not rule out the possibility. His forces are rapidly escalating operations on the high seas, and this could have far-reaching consequences in the region. Here's a report.
Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves on Earth, and whoever controls that oil controls power. When the United States president launched a pressure campaign meant to choke Caracas and force political change, the goal was simple: break the system and take back influence. But while Washington was tightening sanctions, something unexpected was happening behind the scenes. Tankers were moving, deals were being signed, and Beijing was quietly stepping into the vacuum. This wasn't a loud takeover. It was strategic, patient, and devastatingly effective. Today, we're breaking down how the United States lost its grip on Venezuela's oil and how China turned pressure into opportunity.
Global oil markets rarely sit still, but few moments have exposed the raw tension of great power rivalry as clearly as the struggle over Venezuela's vast petroleum reserves. When the United States president set out to squeeze Caracas and reshape control of one of the world's largest oil endowments, the move was meant to send a message far beyond Latin America. Instead, it triggered a strategic opening that Beijing was ready to exploit. What followed was not a sudden takeover, but a slow, calculated shift of influence that left Washington sidelined and China firmly embedded in Venezuela's energy future. At the center of the drama was Venezuela's oil. With the largest proven crude reserves on the planet, the country has long been a strategic prize, even as years of mismanagement, corruption, and political turmoil crippled its production. For Washington, Venezuela represented both a geopolitical challenge and an economic opportunity. The United States president's approach was rooted in the belief that pressure, economic, diplomatic, and corporate, could force political change in Caracas and reopen the oil sector on terms favorable to American interests. The strategy relied heavily on sanctions. Washington imposed sweeping financial and energy restrictions designed to cut Venezuela off from global markets, starve the government of revenue, and weaken the leadership's grip on power. By targeting the state oil company and limiting access to refining technology, spare parts, and international finance, the United States president aimed to push the country toward collapse or capitulation. The expectation was that a friendly leadership would eventually emerge, reverse state control, and invite Western oil giants back into Venezuela's fields. Yet the plan faced resistance from the start. Sanctions hurt ordinary Venezuelans, but they failed to deliver a decisive political outcome. The government in Caracas proved more resilient than expected, relying on alternative trade channels, domestic controls, and support from non-Western partners. Inside the country, nationalism and suspicion of foreign intervention limited the appeal of Washington's pressure campaign. Abroad, many governments were reluctant to fully align with a strategy that risked humanitarian fallout and regional instability. Oil giants also played a complex role. Major Western energy companies, wary of legal risks and uncertain political outcomes, hesitated to invest heavily under sanctions. Even firms with historical ties to Venezuela found themselves constrained by compliance rules and the fear of penalties. The very sanctions meant to open the door for American influence ended up discouraging private capital from stepping in. As production continued to decline, Venezuela's need for external partners became more urgent and more selective. This was the opening China had been waiting for. Beijing had spent years cultivating relationships across Latin America, framing itself as a reliable partner uninterested in domestic political change. In Venezuela, China moved carefully, combining diplomacy, finance, and energy cooperation. Rather than openly challenging Washington, Beijing focused on filling gaps left by Western withdrawal. Chinese companies offered loans, infrastructure support, and technology adapted to Venezuela's heavy crude, often structured through oil-backed repayment deals. China's approach was pragmatic. It did not demand sweeping reforms or political alignment beyond stability and repayment. By extending credit when others would not, Beijing gained leverage over production and export decisions. Chinese firms increased their presence in upstream projects, logistics, and refining arrangements, gradually integrating Venezuelan oil into China's long-term energy supply chain. For Caracas, the partnership offered breathing room. For Beijing, it delivered access to discounted crude and strategic influence in a region traditionally seen as Washington's backyard. Sanctions shaped every step of this process. While Western companies faced strict limits, China's state-linked firms operated with greater flexibility, often using intermediaries and alternative payment systems to bypass restrictions. The result was not a sudden surge in production, but a reorientation of Venezuela's oil flows toward Asia. Tankers rerouted, contracts were rewritten, and trade patterns shifted quietly but decisively. Global energy politics amplified the impact. As oil markets tightened due to conflicts, production cuts, and post-pandemic demand, every barrel mattered. Venezuela's output, though diminished, became strategically valuable. China's willingness to invest during downturns positioned it to benefit as prices recovered. Meanwhile, Washington's influence over Venezuelan oil policy continued to erode, even as sanctions remained formally in place. The geopolitical consequences have been far-reaching. For the United States, the episode underscored the limits of coercive economic tools in a multipolar world. Sanctions imposed without broad international buy-in created opportunities for rivals rather than isolating the target. Washington retained significant financial power, but its ability to shape outcomes on the ground weakened as alternative networks expanded. For China, the gains went beyond oil barrels. By presenting itself as a steady partner during crisis, Beijing strengthened its reputation across the global south. Venezuela became a case study in China's broader strategy: avoid ideological confrontation, offer material support, and secure long-term assets. The relationship also fit into China's energy security agenda, reducing dependence on Middle Eastern routes and diversifying supply. Venezuela itself navigated a narrow path. Chinese involvement provided relief, but also deepened dependence. Oil-backed loans limited fiscal flexibility, and technology transfers did not fully offset years of decay. Still, the government in Caracas gained leverage by demonstrating it had options beyond Washington. The country's survival strategy became intertwined with Asia's demand and China's strategic patience. Global energy markets felt subtler effects. The reallocation of Venezuelan oil toward China contributed to shifting trade flows and pricing dynamics. It highlighted how sanctions can fragment markets, creating parallel systems of trade that bypass traditional hubs. For producers under pressure, the message was clear: alternative partnerships could blunt Western leverage. The role of oil giants remained ambivalent. Some Western firms lobbied quietly for sanctions relief, arguing that engagement would better serve energy stability and influence. Others stayed on the sidelines, wary of reputational and regulatory risks. Chinese companies, backed by state policy, accepted longer timelines and lower short-term returns, confident that strategic positioning would pay off. The episode also reshaped perceptions of power. Control over oil no longer depends solely on military reach or corporate dominance. Financing, logistics, technology, and diplomacy matter just as much. China's incremental gains in Venezuela illustrated how influence can be built through persistence rather than confrontation. As Washington reassessed its approach, debates intensified over whether sanctions should be eased to regain leverage or maintained to uphold principles. The reality was that reversing China's foothold would be difficult. Once supply chains, contracts, and political relationships are established, they are not easily undone. The struggle over Venezuela's oil did not end with a clear victor, but the balance shifted unmistakably. The United States President's attempt to reshape Caracas through pressure exposed the risks of assuming unrivaled influence. China's response demonstrated how strategic patience and economic statecraft can exploit openings created by others' rigidity. Looking ahead, the implications extend far beyond Venezuela. As the United States and China compete across energy, technology, and diplomacy, similar contests are likely to play out in other resource-rich nations facing Western pressure. Oil remains a pillar of global power, even as the energy transition accelerates. Control over production, financing, and trade routes will continue to shape alliances and rivalries. The lesson from Venezuela is not that sanctions are obsolete or that China's model is flawless. It is that global oil power is becoming more dispersed. Countries under pressure will seek partners willing to engage on their terms, and great powers that rely solely on coercion may find themselves outmaneuvered. In the end, the shift in Venezuela's oil alignment signaled a broader trend in the evolving world order. Competition between Washington and Beijing is no longer confined to tariffs or speeches. It is embedded in pipelines, shipping lanes, and long-term contracts. As the United States and China look toward the future, the battle for energy influence will likely be quieter, more complex, and more decisive than ever before.